Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name's John Slow and I'm joined by my colleagues Alex and Kate, and we're delighted to share with you today some highlights from our recent research on electric fleets, 6 approaches to EV charging. Now you should see the new slide if your software is working well. As I said, my name is John Slow. I'm a director here at Delta, and I'm joined by my colleagues Alex.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Yes, my name's Alex Lewis-Jones, and I am the product manager for our electric vehicles and electricity research service. And the highlights that we're offering today is coming straight from our service.
Morning everybody, I'm Kate. I've been working with Alex on the development of the content for this particular study and wider support of the EV&E subscription service that Delta offers.
Thanks Alex, thanks Kate. On to the next slide, we'll just run through very brief housekeeping rules. As I've said in the introduction, we'll run for 30 minutes and 10 minutes questions, so about 40 minutes in total. You can use the questions or chat feature on the webinar toolbar, should be on the right-hand side of your screen, and send questions to us. We'll endeavour to answer them during the webinar, and if not, then we'll follow up after the webinar as well. Please note the webinar is being recorded. We will be sending all of you the slides and the recording for you to look at later on or share with your colleagues. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with Delta, we'll do one intro slide on Delta and then move straight into the content. As you can see here, 4 sections talking about fleets, the value chain, what people are actually doing in this area, and what we think for the outlook of this topic. Moving on to the very short introduction to Delta. Those of you that don't know us, we exist to help companies navigate the transition from old energy to new energy. And you can see on the slide here the different topics we focus on. And as Alex and Kate have said, this research that we're sharing with you, or the highlights that we're sharing with you, are coming straight from our EVs and Electricity Subscription Research Service. Those that you want to know more can visit our website, ask us questions about Delta. Moving on now. So I'll hand over to Alex, who will tell us a bit about what are fleets. Some of you will know intimately, some of you may welcome the context. Alex.
Okay, thank you very much, John. So we thought we'd just start by introducing some of the ideas around what a fleet is. For us, we're talking about any group of vehicles that is primarily used for business use, and that can vary tremendously in terms of scale. So it could be a business with one single vehicle, through to those businesses that have tens or even hundreds of thousands of vehicles on their books. I thought it would be useful to show you some of the numbers from across Europe for what the vehicle market looks like. And there are different categories of vehicle. To begin with, we've got passenger vehicles, so cars. This is by far the largest segment of vehicle. They can be, of course, privately owned or business registered. And there is a bit of grey area there where we have vehicles that are leased or are maybe long-term hire vehicles. But essentially, we're interested in those cars that are used in a business context. This might be for doing business travel or visiting sites, or if you, say, own an airport, you might have a number of cars running around airside along the runway. As of the end of last year, there were about 830,000 plug-in EVs in the market across Europe, and they're still made up a very small part of the market. Moving up, we had the light commercial vehicles, or vans, and we considered these up to the weight of 3.5 tons. So vans typically more business-focused vehicles, more focused on moving things rather than people. So you'll have delivery vehicles and the like. There are a similar proportion of the market, so about 0.2% of the current market is plug-in EV at the moment, but it is a much smaller market compared to cars. And then a final category would be the heavy commercial vehicles. So looking at the vehicles above that weight of 3.5 tons. Now, there are an increasing number of EVs looking to enter this particular market, but with the very low proportion of them right now, we considered this more of a pilot phase, and we have not considered this in our report, along with other specialist vehicles such as buses or agricultural or non-road mobile machinery. So our focus is on cars and vans.
Alex, we've got our first question, which is a clarification question on the numbers there. Is that 2017, 2018 numbers?
Yeah, so these numbers were taken from the most recent report at the time, which was from October and November of 2018. And that's for across Europe, so all countries.
Thanks, Alex. So there's some quite interesting numbers of EVs in this table. Alex, how does that compare to the overall market for EVs in Europe? Is this a tiny fraction? Is it the majority of the market? Can you put it in context a bit, please?
Yeah, so it gets a bit more, there's a lot of grey areas in terms of how people use their EVs. A lot of people have them for their own private use, and there are a lot of company car owners that might also have a car that they use for business use. So by and large, it is a more slender segment at the moment compared to the private owners, but we are expecting to see that grow rapidly. And there's a number of reasons for why this is a particularly exciting customer segment to consider. First of all, we know that there are some problems in helping fleets go to electric. It's well observed in numbers of fleet manager surveys that there just aren't the right vehicles. And we know we've had another question here about that weight, around 3.5 tons. One of the key barriers is can I fit enough things into the back of my van? Is there enough payload? Does it have the right mileage? And this has been one of the limiting factors. This is beginning to change. We are seeing larger and a better variety of vehicles out on the market. This will lead to more adoption over the next couple of years, and in turn, that will mean more EV charging. As fleets, they do behave slightly differently to private individuals in terms of how they are managed. Fleet management is a sector in itself, and people observe the journeys that these fleets are taking. And from that, we know, okay, if that's how many journeys we're doing by electric, that's how much charging our requirement is going to be. So it's easier to quantify our needs. And finally, in terms of procurement, those fleet managers think economically about those vehicles. So TCO refers to total cost of ownership. And that is looking across the whole lifespan of the vehicle, all the different costs that involved. And that makes it easier to internalize the investment in EV charge points throughout that lifetime. Two key ways we can segment fleet customers is by where they park. Obviously, with all electric vehicle charging, it's very important to know where vehicles park, because right now that's where they're going to be charging. And there's a big difference between those that return to home, so based at at employees' homes, compared to those that are returned to the workplace, are based at depots. The way that we approach an EV charging solution differs considerably across these. Most fleets will have some kind of mix, but we did want to raise that as a particular definition here.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks everyone for the questions coming in. We'll have to respond to some of these either during or more likely after the webinar, but we'll take as many as we can during. So we've looked at what fleets are. Kate, can you talk us through the fleet EV charging value chain?
Yeah. So we looked at the whole of the value chain, and we've broken it down into different segments. So we'll start with what's probably the most recognizable areas of the value chain in terms of charging infrastructure, which is the provision of the hardware, the installation and ongoing maintenance of that hardware, and then the back office system that is provided for the centralized control and management of the charging. So these three things represent what I would call effectively what a business needs from an operational point of view. If you're running an electric vehicle fleet operationally, these are the three things that you need. I should add that we have assumed and focused our attentions on communications enabled infrastructure. It is possible, of course, to have simply hardware and installation and maintenance without the back office, where you've got units that are effectively not smart enabled or communications enabled. But for us, we believe that if you're operating a reasonable sized fleet of electric vehicles, that back office management is key to help you monitor the status of your fleet, to undertake any remote diagnostics, to produce centralized reporting, and something that crops up quite regularly is billing management. But when you think about a fleet of vehicles, you have a natural aggregation because you're selling to one person, e.g. the fleet manager, a suite of electric vehicles. So clearly that's an essential part of the EV charging value chain. In that you need someone who has procured vehicles or who is in the process of procuring vehicles before you can really start that conversation about what charging infrastructure you need. And specifically within the fleet segment, we see a niche at the very beginning of that value chain, which is around feasibility and education. So there are a number of companies, particularly around the automotive sector, a number of services that are effectively providing that feasibility and consultancy, so helping fleets build the business case for electrification. And then we add on to the operational element of the back office what we call enhanced back office. And from an electric vehicles and electricity point of view, this is where the conversation becomes slightly more dynamic, because we're talking about dynamic load management, time shifting services, offering demand response services to the grid, and ultimately V2G. So at the moment, as a fleet manager, you don't need to have those things. They're being presented very much as an enhancement, not an essential service from an operational point of view. And then finally, access, which is linking in with e-mobility service providers or fuel card providers, as an example, to make sure that your fleet has access to charging not only at the depot, but also whilst on the road.
Thanks, Kate. From looking at the value chain, what parts of it do you see as the most challenging or the most difficult in the market today?
Okay. So, I mean, the obvious one, and Alex has already picked up on this, is that electric vehicles, certainly within the up to 3.5 ton segment, only represents 0.2% of the vehicles on the road. So finding your audience, who you want to engage with, is particularly challenging. This is where the lease companies and the automotive companies have an advantage, because they are getting early sight of the businesses that are beginning to engage on fleet electrification. And I think the second challenging area is much more around the enhanced back office. There's an awful lot here culturally and operationally that a fleet manager has to absorb and understand, and they have to make a lot of changes to how they operate today. And it's not surprising that engaging them on enhanced back office functionality when it is not mission critical to them at that moment in time is another challenge.
Thanks, Kate. There's a lot in that value chain, and certainly a lot more than just the hardware charge point installation.
So we've indicated on the slide also, which isn't breaking news, but you have this breakdown of upfront capital costs, particularly with the vehicle, with the hardware and the installation, and you can be talking about very significant hardware and installation costs when you're talking about a fleet of 20 or 30 vehicles. We see that the back office is key for ensuring recurring savings. So, for example, something that's focused on quite regularly is using your back office system for remote diagnostics and potentially remote fixing of charge points that are offline, and that has quite a significant recurring saving as opposed to sending a man in a van out to effect that repair. And then the final area of value, it really is this additional savings and, in the future, potential revenue.
Thanks, Kate. So we've looked at fleets, we've looked at the charging value chain. Let's now move on to what we see happening in the market and how we make sense of that. So over to Alex now, who's going to tell us a bit about the key approaches that are emerging in this space. Alex.
Yeah, thank you, John. So, yeah, we see a number of different approaches. In this report, we have gone out to the market. We've looked at a wide variety of different providers of charging solutions targeting fleets from across a number of different countries. We've summarized these into 6 particular approaches that we saw particular propositions looking at. I'll go through these quickly for you now. So the very first one we called plug and go. So this is for fleets who've defined their need and they need a charge point. So they have these typically charging suppliers have already got the charge point, can install it for people and provide that back office. And that is focusing on the core of the value chain that Kate explored with us earlier on. Getting to one that takes on a bit more of the front end of that value chain is what we call the EV handholder. So we looked at that feasibility stage. Well, there are a number of players who are looking to get in right at the beginning and guide people through that with consultancy and what kind of vehicles they want, maybe provide those vehicles as well, and then that naturally leads into the charge point procurement and services that they can provide. Similar to this, there is the one-stop shop. So this is perhaps like an EV handholder, taking you through those steps, but essentially being a place where you can get all of these different elements together in one place at one particular time. Now, you'll notice that I put some logos underneath these underneath these approaches, and we have seen some of the utilities starting to build up one-stop shop websites where they are providing at least the route to various parts of the value chain. In the EV handholder, I've put down LeasePlan as a lease company who are active here, and Ellie being the recent announcement from Volkswagen Group, who have indicated that they want to help people through this process and are specifically targeting fleets to do so. Moving on, we have charging as a service. This is an emerging space, and we are seeing a variety of different players looking at how they can develop a more OpEx-focused package for fleets. Then focusing on those energy services, those additional benefits that can be useful for a workplace or essential if there's a capacity constraint. There are some energy retailers who are looking to add this in to their proposition. And finally, there's one around reimbursement. So this focuses on those fleets that return to home, and how do you pay for the electricity that those employees are going to have to use to charge their vehicle for business purposes.
Thanks, Alex. Really nice to have the 6 approaches mapped out like that and examples in each one. How would you characterize where the general focus is in the market? Are there patterns emerging? Is there particular areas where most people are focusing? Yeah, can you give us a feel for what the market's actually doing around these 6 different approaches?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the ones that we've put in the top row, these are certainly the ones that are leading the way at the moment, either in those that are delivering charge points today or are the leading propositions being advertised out there. Particularly the plug and go and the EV handholder are certainly ones we see as prominent here. We think the others will likely grow, but of course the reimbursement focus one is just on home-based fleets, so that has more of a limit to how big that will grow into the market.
Thanks, Alex. I think we've got a couple of examples coming and then a poll that would encourage you all to participate in, to ask you your thoughts on how the market will develop. But before the poll, let's look at those examples where in our research we've dived into a lot of detail here, but we'll share a couple of examples that we think are quite interesting. Alex?
Yeah. So just going on about that reimbursement focus approach. We've used the example of Plug Surfing here, who are a very prominent mobility service provider across Europe. They provide the access to charging networks in public areas across a number of different countries, and they're growing very rapidly. One extra service that their system enables, their software and their app, is to actually reimburse employees for the electricity that they're using at home. So if you have a business vehicle, you park it at your on your driveway via a charge point there. As long as you can connect your charging session via their app or their RFID fob, then you will be able to be reimbursed by your employer for that electricity. The way this works is that the Plug Surfing collects the information about how much electricity is being charged, informs the employer, and through a loop that gets paid back to the owner. And we're seeing a number of different opportunities here arising as this return to home fleet starts to grow. So that's an important one to watch out for in the next few years.
Thanks, Alex. One question before we move on to the next example that's come in. Do we see many of the automotive OEMs providing feasibility and consulting services, so that part at the beginning of the value chain, or are they largely absent from that part of the market at the moment?
Yeah, so I think we can maybe return to this right at the end, but Kate definitely touched on this earlier on about how fleet managers need to go through this cultural change, and actually a lot of support is there through the direct communication with the fleet. As a result, we do see a lot of lease companies looking at getting involved in providing this as consultancy piece. There are some OEMs who, certainly with the larger accounts, who might deal straight with the OEM. If you're purchasing thousands of vehicles at a time, they will obviously provide this support. I use the example of Volkswagen Group with Ellie as maybe a more bespoke proposition out there.
Okay, so the OEMs will get involved today where they're currently involved with the fleet manager. Ellie's may be an example where an OEM is going to extend their involvement and go more direct to the mid-size or smaller customers.
Agreed, and it might have a different point of entry. It might come through the energy manager, say. So.
Yeah. Okay, so second example, and then on to the poll.
Yeah, so we've looked at Ensto, which is a large business that operates out of Finland. They are they describe themselves as a smart electrical solutions. So they don't just do charging infrastructure, they do other smart city solutions as well. And I think that smart city context has really informed how Ensto has approached the EV charging market across Europe in a similar fashion. So It's not impossible that you could say that they were a plug and go provider, because they have developed extremely robust hardware that is extremely reliable, and they have also invested significantly in their back office system and their cloud, which allows a significant amount of interoperability with other back office systems or e-mobility service providers. However, when we spoke to Ensto, they're piloting a number of projects and products. In the UK, they're working with Phoenix Works to offer a charging as a service proposition. So rather than paying for the hardware and installation of the infrastructure up front, that is effectively translated into a monthly fee. And that monthly fee is calculated based on the availability rate of the infrastructure. So in that context, reliability and uptime is absolutely crucial, because for any period of time that their charge points are not available or offline, that's income that they can't be gathering. So it's good for the fleet, because it means that they don't have this large capex investment to be made at the beginning, but it also means that they've got assurance that what they do have on their premises will be reliable and working.
Thanks, Kate. And this as a service model is something we see across many aspects of the new energy space. We had a question about how the infrastructure is being funded. And I guess this is an example where it's not funded by the end user or necessarily by the charge point manufacturer. There might be a role for a finance company here to come in and provide that yes. funding.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we found. There are less examples in the fleet space than there are in the public charging space. I think utilization rates before the equipment is installed, yes, you can predict that using telematics data and looking at the size of the fleet, but there is an element of caution in terms of providing that infrastructure free of charge, because you really need the reassurance that you're going to get that utilization back.
Okay, but as there's more certainty or more data, more experience, yes. then that will likely increase. Yeah, thanks. Okay, moving on to the promised poll. So your voting here is completely anonymous. Well, we actually do see how you voted, but we don't publish who voted for what. So yes, feel free to vote without your votes being disclosed on the webinar. Alex, do you want to launch the poll and talk people through what you're asking them?
Certainly. So you should now see on your screens a question pop up, and the question is, what type of player is best positioned to serve EV charging solutions to fleets? So we've got 4 options for you here. Charge point suppliers, so this might be the manufacturer or the distributor of that of the charge point solution. It could be an energy retailer. It could be a utility who is looking to get into this space. Maybe the vehicle suppliers. So we've talked about OEMs and lease companies already. And maybe it is the fuel retailer. The traditional provider of fuel might look to see if they can, there's a lot of fuel cards that are used for fleets today. Could that be an option for providing EV charging solutions in the future?
So we can see lots of you have voted. We'll give you maybe 10 seconds more to vote. Remember, your vote is not revealed on the webinar. So we've got I think a fairly clear pattern coming in. The last 5 seconds to place your vote. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's close it, and I think we can publish the results of the poll. Alex, any views on what we see?
It's very interesting, isn't it? So 45% say energy retailers, and from that we did have about 80% of all the attendees taking part in this. So that's a really interesting position. We did see the likes of some of the really large energy retailers setting up one-stop shops like E.ON and NLX. We know they are increasingly looking to how to put their propositions into this space. far fewer said the fuel retailers would be best placed to do this, which is really interesting, and less on the vehicle suppliers, which is an interesting one. If they, as we said, might be best placed to talk with the fleet manager, and that might be a good route to market.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So moving on now to some of our overall view, having carried out this research.
Thank you, John. So by way of summary, fleets are, I hope you will agree, a very attractive high value segment. And this really is quite obviously because you're not engaging with one person for one vehicle, but potentially if you win a fleet, then you have a natural aggregation of volume, which could be half a dozen vehicles, but could be significantly higher, running into hundreds of electric vehicles. So for that reason alone, this will continue to be a very popular segment, and it is going to attract bespoke products and services. But before we get ahead of ourselves, the education is and will remain important. We think for the next decade, and that's because there is a significant amount of cultural acceptance that is required around the electrification of fleet. But there is also a significant amount of operational changes that also need to be made. So in terms of how vehicles are allocated, the routing, the scheduling, the payload, there's a lot of operational changes that need to be addressed when you are electrifying a fleet. And as the penetration of electric vehicles in a fleet grows, the tools that will be needed to ensure operational stability will need to become more sophisticated. So education is important, and education is also important for the enhanced back office and the energy savvy users. We can already see, and we touched on this in our earlier smart charging webinar that we did last year, but we can already see that for fleets there are immediate needs for local load balancing and local smart charging, particularly where there are on-site supply constraints. But to go beyond that and to look at the enhanced value, more work and more education is needed. And from Delta's viewpoint, we see a wider adoption of the charging as a service model. And I think it's, the obvious statement is that fleets are already used to leasing vehicles. That's a very, very popular route for vehicle acquisition. So extending that to make it charging as a service alongside the leasing of the vehicle is a natural proposition. It may not be offered by the OEMs. If we look at the 8% in the poll, maybe it's much more about partnerships and partnering with energy companies to offer those long-term solutions.
Thanks, Kate. I guess what we're seeing here is an emerging market with some incumbent players like the leasing companies you've mentioned, some companies that are new to this space but have potentially good credentials to play, like energy suppliers, or like OEMs dealing with the smaller fleets, for example, they don't currently deal with. So I think it's fascinating to see the different models that companies are taking to market, the battle in a way between the different players here. And Kate, one word you think, I think you said that will be key is partnerships. So maybe the poll we asked you is slightly unfair, and it's not an either-or question, it's an and question. We'll move on to one last slide and then time for one last question, I think. So this, I guess, shows you the context of the research that was shared in our wider Electric Vehicles and Electricity Research Service. On the right, you can see some of the recent research that we've published under the service, and below the topics that we're currently working on. So we're very excited to be running our customer research at the moment across 5 countries, I think, Alex. Yep, 5 different countries across Europe. Very interested in what we find from that. And one thing we haven't shown here is our New Energy Summit, which we're holding in Amsterdam on the 28th and 29th of May. And EVs features for half a day in this 2-day summit. So if we come back now maybe to the questions that have come in, and thank you again for all the questions. We don't have time to respond to them all now, but we will come back to you individually. One simple question, but really nice question. What are the biggest challenges for the development of electric fleets? So from all the research we've done, I can see Alex and Kate both thinking hard as I've said this. There's lots of challenges. We've talked about a lot of them. But if you had to pick out one thing that will be absolutely critical to get as much electrification into fleets as we can, what would you pick out? So putting you both on the spot here.
Okay, I'll go first. And I think from that broad question around electric fleets, for me, it has to be about getting the volumes of vehicles available. Linking it with an earlier question we had about the 3.5 ton limit. Obviously, we know that in certain countries that they're changing that to allow a more heavier vehicle within certain bands of segment, because the batteries are going to be so heavy and are pushing the limits of what an OEM can produce. So we are still limited, but I really like to kind of chunk up the kind of the market into where we're seeing things today compared to where we would be in, say, 5 years time, and where we'd be in 2030. The barrier today is definitely around those fleets, around those fleet vehicles. Come 2025, there will be much greater variety and availability of those vehicles, and those who've trialed 1 or 2 vehicles will be moving towards much greater adoption, switching all of their fleet rather than just a few. So come by 2030, we'll see a much more rapid movement away. By that time, we'd have all the models available, I'll hope.
Thanks, Alex. We look forward to seeing all those models in the next years being released. Kate?
I echo everything that Alex has said around the choice of certainly of commercial vehicles available today and their availability. So cost, payload, range continue to come up as barriers. Mm-hmm. I have a strong degree of confidence that all 3 of those things are being addressed, and we just need to be patient, because it's some big changes that are happening in the automotive world. Once those vehicles are there, I think the challenges around the infrastructure are going to be potentially the period of return on investment. So when you're leasing a vehicle, you typically cycle optimistically 4 years. It could be 5 or 6 years. To get your return on investment on charging infrastructure, you may have to make a longer term commitment. If you don't own the premises where you are based and you rent, that is quite a risk, to tie yourself to that return on investment. So hopefully charging as a service will address that.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Alex, for those answers. Overall, I think there's a big appetite amongst fleet, or a big interest amongst fleets for electrification. Some challenges maybe in the vehicle availability, some challenges in the feasibility study side at the beginning, but all the way through the value chain. So plenty of opportunity, plenty of emerging activity. We're going to keep looking at this space as part of our wider research. We really appreciate all the questions that we've had, and we would love to receive any comments, thoughts, challenges after as well. So you'll all receive copies of the slides and recording. Please do get back in touch with us if you do have any questions or comments or thoughts. The research we carry out is very much steered by what the market wants and would need. So any suggestions as to what you'd like us to be focusing on as well would be great. So we're finishing pretty much bang on time. Thanks to you all for listening. Alex, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. Thanks for everybody for joining us. We had a vast number of questions out there, which I'd love to have the time to answer. I don't, but I will make sure that myself or one of our colleagues here will respond to your question over the next day or so.
Great. Thanks everyone for your
Thank
attention.
you.
And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.